Chapter 16, Part 2, page 225. Uncle Max sat listening intently. "If I wasn't seeing this with my own eyes, I'd never believe it," he muttered, looking up at the ceiling and shaking his head. "But none of this explains why you went to Lucretia Cutter's house." "Lucretia Cutter visited Humphrey and Pickering last week," Virginia explained, "on the night they kidnapped Darcus. Novak saw me looking out of the window and dropped that card." Darcus pointed at it. "Lucretia Cutter was here," Uncle Max recoiled. Darcus nodded. "She's buying the Beatles." "Over my dead body she is," Uncle Max growled. Virginia looked at him surprised. "That's why I went to her house, to find out why she wants them. But also," Darcus paused, "also to find out whatever it is about her and Dad that you won't tell me." Uncle Max's eyebrows shot up. "I see. Now it's your turn to tell the truth," Darcus said, thinking about the photograph on Lucretia Cutter's desk. "What's the Faber Project?" Uncle Max lifted his safari hat, smoothed down his hair and replaced it, looking at Darcus as if measuring him in some way. "I made a solemn promise to your father when you were born that I would never speak of the Faber Project to you, or anyone else for that matter." He scratched his chin. "But then we never knew we'd find ourselves here, did we?" Darcus stared at his uncle. "I thought it was you keeping something from me, that you didn't trust me." He turned away. "But all along Dad's been the one keeping secrets." "Your dad trusts you, lad," Uncle Max said. "It's just, there are some things that the young shouldn't be burdened with." "When Dad disappeared, people said terrible things about him." Darcus's voice was flat and unemotional. "But I kept his face here." He tapped his finger between his eyes. "Each time someone said that he'd run away, or that he'd killed himself, I knew that they were wrong here." He touched a fist to his heart. "Because my dad would never do that. My dad isn't like that." He looked up at his uncle, his vision blurred by tears. "But I don't know what my dad really is like, do I? I don't know him at all." "Nonsense. Look at me, lad." Uncle Max took Darcus's hand. "You know your father better than anyone. But before he was your dad, he was a young man with ambition and without the responsibility of a family. That young man was like you in many ways, and he was a great adventurer. That's something you should be proud to learn. An adventurer, like you." No, I search for secrets, dig for tunnels, and if I'm lucky, I'll find an interesting story or a valuable object." Uncle Max sighed. "Your father's adventures were far greater than any of mine, and more dangerous. His adventures were in thought. He explored the very fabric of nature, experimented with possibility, and all within the confines of his own head. You can only do that sort of thing if you have a brilliant mind, and he does. Mine's rather ordinary by comparison. Your father, Darcus, is the kind of person who changes history." "That doesn't sound like Dad," Darcus frowned. His father was gentle and liked staring out of windows. He would never describe him as an adventurer. "That's because he stopped his adventures when you came along." "But why?" "Adventures are dangerous, Darcus, and villains are real." Uncle Max seemed to grow older as he spoke. "Ideas are powerful, and there are people who'll exploit even the most charitable idea for power or money. The greedy stop at nothing to satisfy their appetites, with no thought to the devastation or destruction it causes." He sounded angry. "That's not a world in which your father wanted to raise a family." "Dad gave it up to have me. In a manner of speaking." Uncle Max rested his chin on his hands. "Barty was an entomologist, a genius with arthropods. He specialised in Coleoptera. Beetles were his passion. And because of his great skill in observing and understanding insects, Professor Appleyard invited him to be one of the esteemed scientists working on the Faber Project." "An entomologist?" Uncle Max nodded. "The Faber Project had a bold remit to see if it was possible to reverse the damage humans have done to the planet by harnessing the power of insects." "The power of insects?" Bertolt whispered in awe. "Is that possible?" "The sad fact is, the number of insects is in decline. As we destroy their habitats, so we destroy their species. But we desperately need them. If all the mammals on the planet were to die out, the planet would flourish. But if the insects disappeared, everything would very soon be dead." Led by Professor Appleyard, the Faber project explored the possibility of setting up global insect farms to breed species of insects that would boost pollination, naturally control for pests, cutting down the use of pesticides, provide humans with food, and deal with human and animal waste. The dumb division, Virginia snickered. Esme was part of that team. That's how your father met her. Mum was a scientist. Darcus was flabbergasted. She was a fine ecologist, Uncle Max said. He shook his head with a sad smile. Your father was working with a geneticist to see what could be achieved by tampering with the genetic makeup of beetles. Lucretia Cutter, Darcus spat. She was plain old Dr. Lucy Johnston back then. An odd girl, if I'm honest, but she was very clever and fiercely ambitious. She and Barty had a major breakthrough with their transgenic experiments on certain types of beetles. Transgenic? Virginia frowned. What does that mean? It means changing the genetic structure of an organism by adding genes from another organism. They took genes from mice and successfully added them to the genes of a beetle. A beetle mouse? Virginia laughed. I don't get it. What's so amazing about a beetle mouse? The first transgenic experiments used genes from mice. Uncle Max paused for an uncomfortably long time. But the aim, the true aim, was to find a transgenic process that would successfully transfer human genes into beetles, producing a new species of beetles capable of intelligent thought to work collaboratively with humans and clean up the environment. Beetles with a human gene? Darcus looked at Baxter perched on his shoulder. Did they do it? Virginia sat up, staring at Newton bobbing about Bertolt's head. Did they discover the trans-thingy process? Uncle Max sighed, looking at Baxter. I've seen a beetle behave like Baxter before, when your father was still working on the Faber project, and it was carrying his genes. Our beetles are transgenic? Bertolt looked up at Newton, smiling in wonder. Darcus studied Baxter. Was Dad's beetle a rhinoceros beetle too? It was a Goliath beetle. And he was a majestic beast. Darcus thought about the zebra-striped beetle he'd seen on Beetle Mountain. What happened to him? Barty had Goliath frozen and donated him to the Natural History Museum's collection for future research. Darcus blinked. He was certain that if they looked, they would find that Dad's beetle had gone. What happened to the Faber project? Virginia asked. When they started having successful results, Lucy tried to persuade Barty to leave the project and set up their own laboratory. She believed their work would make them rich. She didn't want to help the planet, Berta asked, dismayed. Well, she's got loads of money, Virginia said. Yes, she has now, Uncle Max agreed. Dad refused, Darcus said with certainty. Uncle Max nodded. Realising what her motives were, Barty destroyed all their research and handed in his resignation to Professor Appleyard, explaining what Lucy was planning. Outraged and furious, Lucy Johnston disappeared, emerging several years later under a new name, Lucretia Cutter. Without the genetics work, the Faber project floundered and it was closed down. Darcus's dad destroyed his research, Bertolt said. But he didn't, did he, Uncle Max? Darcus stared at his uncle. It's upstairs in your flat. He had remembered where he'd seen the words Faber project, the box that ripped open with Nefertiti's teeth in it. It was full of folders that said Faber project on the side. Uncle Max looked grey. I didn't want to take it. I'm not a fan of mucking about with nature. I'm a man of the old world, and I didn't approve of what your father was doing. I felt he was opening Pandora's box. In fact, we almost fell out about it. Barty promised your mother that he'd burn the research, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. So I agreed to keep it, on the condition that he'd never meddle with it again. It's been sitting in my box room for years. I'd forgotten it was there until you came to stay. Lucretia Cutter said that the beetles belonged to her, Uncle Max said. It was only a matter of time before she found a way to complete the human beetle transgenic process on her own. This is serious, isn't it? Darcus said. Very, Uncle Max replied gravely. Beetles are the single most successful species of creature on this planet. They can adapt to almost any environment. The question your father was trying to answer was, what happens if you genetically enhance the most adaptable creature on the planet? I thought that was the most dangerous question I had ever heard. But Lucretia Cutter also said that she wasn't ready yet, Darcus said, remembering what she'd said in the room with the two-way mirror. and that she wouldn't let anybody stop her. Not them, not him, nobody. I think Dad was trying to stop her. I've been trying to find out what she's up to, but every avenue I've explored turns up a blank. It's impossible to investigate her. No one will speak about her. They're all petrified. Uncle Mac shook his head. However, I am certain of one thing. Whatever she's up to, we have to do everything in her power to stop her. We've got to tell the police, Bertolt said. The police are astonishingly uninterested in investigating any of the leads that I've provided them with. But why? Bertolt asked. Because someone is exerting their power and making sure that Barty's disappearance is not looked into. Lucretia Cutter, Virginia snarled. And if she thought that we knew where Barty was, she'd move him immediately and we'll never find him, Uncle Max said. So we have to tread very carefully. We can't trust anyone except each other. Darkus looked at Virginia and Bertolt. We have a plan to rescue Dad. Really? Uncle Max smiled. I hoped you might. Care to share it with me? Baxter rose up from his perch on Darkus's shoulder and hovered beside the boy's face. His Electra lifted high, his soft wings vibrating like hummingbirds. We'd love to, said Darkus. But first, I need to go home and get 2 bottles of champagne, Bertolt said, climbing to his feet. Darkus smiled at his uncle's surprised expression. It's all part of the plan.